Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. In the West, when we think about Chinese political figures of importance, the people who come to mind tend to be those like Mao or Xi Jinping. Someone who's less thought of, though, is Sun Yat-sen, otherwise known in China as the father of the nation. Today, I sit down with Tom Fischer, a former graduate student at the University of Oregon, to talk about the life of Sun Yat-sen and his second life after his death. Thanks, Tom, for joining me. You're the first guest on the What is China podcast, so it's great to have you on.
It's an honor and a privilege, Dakota. Good to see you.
So, first of all, I guess tell people what did you do in the master's program in terms of research? Like, what was the theme of your project?
Sure. So I can try to set the scene a little bit. So I started studying China sort of loosely. I didn't have any real grounding in history. I did mostly language courses, I did philosophy courses, I did film, that sort of thing. And I ended up moving more into history in undergrad. And really the big pivot was my undergrad thesis. And one thing in my undergrad thesis, which was an exploration of Wong Jing Wei and his decision to collaborate with the Japanese during the Second World War, was this idea of Chinese Pan-Asianism. And I thought I was going to develop this at the master's program at UO. But it ended up that the real question I want to explore was sort of political malleability. How does political narrative change to suit different circumstances? And how can you look at this through individual figures? So I ended up studying Sun Yat-sen for this instead. As Sun is really, we'll get into this, but he's someone that a lot of people have very disparate opinions on. And so he's an interesting case study for understanding political narrative.
I know it's not the theme of this episode, but you mentioned Wong Jing Wei. Can you give a brief introduction to who he is and why he's important for those who don't know?
Sure. So Wong Jing Wei, if you're familiar with Chinese history, you might be cringing at the name. And if you're not, well, you might think he's a bit of a complicated figure. And truth be told, he is a complicated figure. He was a revolutionary back in the days of the Sinha Rebellion. He was an orator, he was a writer, and he was very cutting edge. The name Jing Wei coming from the goddess Jing Wei, who swears to fill the sea with stones and sticks after drowning in the sea as a little girl. And so he started as a revolutionary, vowing to fill the sea and to fight destiny, essentially, to fight the impossible odds, and to found a Chinese republic. However, after a long career in Kuomintang politics, the Kuomintang being the Nationalist Party, the KMT, Wong Jing Wei ends up defecting in 1938. And by 1940, he's the head of a collaborator government in Nanjing, working with the Japanese. And he dies in 1944 in Nagoya. And it's really his final legacy. He's not remembered so much for his revolutionary work or for his politicking. What he's really remembered as now is a traitor, sort of a Marshal Pétain type figure. And so, but one big thing for Wong Jing Wei is his connection to Sun Yat-sen, and that's sort of how I got on the Sun Yat-sen train, so to speak.
So, and this is a good segue into the main question here is, well, who is Sun Yat-sen? Like, maybe you could start by giving us just, if like we think about it like a Wikipedia page, like what was his early life? Like, where was he born? Where did he grow up?
The basic biography, Sun Yat-sen was not born as Sun Yat-sen. He was born as Sun Dumying. Though, of course, he didn't call himself that. He was Cantonese. He was born in a village in Suiheng, in what is now Zhongshan County, or Zhongshan City, rather. But back then it was Xiangshan County, just outside Macau and a bit south of Guangzhou.
Macau, for people who don't know, that's like in the south of China.
Yes, it's the old Portuguese colony that was given back, I think, in 1999, following the retrocession of Hong Kong. And that's an interesting story, too, because the Portuguese didn't have to give that back. There was no treaty on that. Wow. So that's a bit far afield. So he was born in this sort of really provincial village in South China in 1866 to parents of moderate means. They were technically landholders. They didn't hold much land, though. The family's best days, you could say, were behind them financially. And it was a tough time to be in the Chinese villages back then, the late Qing dynasty. It was not a time of great economic growth. It was not a time of great stability. And it was sort of a difficult upbringing for him. He had a few siblings. A couple of them died, which was fairly common back then. But one of them turned out to be very important for his life, his older brother, Sun Mei. And Sun Mei was, I guess, about 10 years older or so, 10 to 15 years older. And he had emigrated to Hawaii, which was still an independent kingdom at this time. And he had shops in Honolulu. He had a ranch on Maui. And what happens for Sun Yat-sen is he ends up following his brother out to Hawaii when he's a kid. He works in the shop. He doesn't like it, but he goes to school there. He goes to the Alani school. Some people say he went to the St. Louis Academy. That's different sources disagree on the specifics. But he went to the Alani school. He went to Oahu College. And he was actually quite proficient in English, and he learned a lot while he was there. He actually won a prize from the King of Hawaii, King Kalakua, for his proficiency in English. And what happens is that he takes to Hawaii he really likes it after a while. He starts absorbing the local culture. He wants to get baptized. I mean, he's been going to Anglican college or Anglican schools this whole time. And Sun Mei thinks he's been taking to it a little too much. He thinks he's forgetting his roots. And so Sun Mei forces him to go back to Xiangshan. And, Sun Yat-sen, who is still Sun Deming at this point, he was like 16 or 17 years old. He doesn't want to be told what to do, and he doesn't want to be sent back against his will to the provinces. He resented it, I imagine. And when he gets back there, he lashes out, as you might expect an angry teenager to. He burns the town idol. Well, he doesn't burn it, but he breaks off the hand of it. This little idol called the Polar King, the Beiji Huangwang. And he's actually forced to leave. He's essentially forced into exile from the village of Cuiheng. Because such disrespect to the town idol. How could you do such a thing?
Yeah.
People won't be too happy with him. So he and his friend Lu Haozhong were forced to leave for new pastures. They ended up going to Hong Kong. It was in Hong Kong that Sun Yat-sen takes the name. First it was Sun Yat-sen, which in Cantonese sounds, I think, more like Sun Yat-sen. But he ends up taking Sun Yat-sen formally as his pen name because of Sun Yat-sen. That's his name for his baptism. But I guess we're getting a bit into the weeds for the brief introduction, so let's just bring it back to the main point here. So essentially, the big thing to remember about Sun Yat-sen is after this point, he's sort of a loser for about 10 to 15 years. He's a doctor. He does okay. He tries to practice in Macau. He can't get a license there. He goes to practice in Guangzhou. He's okay. And then he gets dissatisfied with the Qing government as it just becomes ever more incompetent, or its incompetence and inadequacy becomes ever more apparent, especially after the Sino-French War of the 1880s. And he starts leading uprisings. Most of them fail. Almost all of them fail, actually. He gets off on a bad foot with the first Guangzhou uprising. 100 of his compatriots are executed. He flees. And he's just constantly being forced to flee. He's constantly being forced to find new territory for fundraising, for organizing. Even his compatriots get sick of him. And eventually, one of the uprisings succeeds, but it's not when he started. We could talk about the Wuchang uprising later.
Sure, yeah.
But it's not that he takes the credit per se, but he gets credited with it. And he becomes the provisional president of the Republic of China upon its founding. But this is a temporary position. He yields power to the warlord Yuan Shikai. And he's back on the run for a while, back organizing, back fundraising, back fighting strange battles, and generally not winning. And this continues essentially until he's an old or I guess I won't say he's an old man. He died fairly young. I think he had gallbladder cancer.
What year did he die?
1925.
1925. Yeah, and I think for those who are not familiar with Chinese history, I mean, looking at Sun Yat-sen's life, he was born during a really crazy and chaotic time in Chinese history. Like certainly, people look at the chaos that's going on now, but you amplify that by about 10, and that's what was happening in China during this time. So Sun Yat-sen definitely did not grow up with an easy early life.
No, he did not. And one thing to remember, especially when we think about civil unrest, this wasn't just civil unrest or economic stagnation. There was active invasion. There were all sorts of things going on in China at the time, and it was really, especially for the politically minded. Sun Yat-sen became a very politically minded person. It became harder to sit idle, but it was also hard to figure out what exactly to do about this. And so Sun Yat-sen was only one of many revolutionaries, only one of many people offering the solution to China's ills, the whole save the nation movements. And one of his big rivals was actually Kang Wei and his successor. I shouldn't forget this.
Are you talking about Liang Qichao?
Certainly am, Yang
Yeah,
Zhijiao.
yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. So he's not the only one, but personally, I think he's one of the more interesting ones because of his legacy following his death in 1925.
Um, yeah, and I think, just in terms of like the politics of Chinese history, I mean, I guess this is probably better for as a later question, but I guess we could start thinking about it now and just coming back to it later. Like when you think about Chinese politics, like if you go up to an average person here in the US and say, hey, can you name for me some notable Chinese figures in political history? The first person they're probably going to say is Mao. And then if they're maybe kind of savvy to the politics of modern China, 21st century China, they might know about Xi Jinping. But I guess like what would you say is the biggest takeaway in terms of why it's important to know about Sun Yat-sen? Like what is his legacy contributing to politics today? And I guess this now kind of delves a little deeper into the theme of your research, which talks about statues. So I'll kind of leave that open ended for you to dive into.
Well, yeah, it's a broad question, and I think the most important thing to remember is it depends on which image of sun you're seeing. Now, part of my research was about statues, but I tried to do a sort of multimedia survey so that we could see, okay, here's how he looks here, here's how he looks there. What's the difference? How is he being portrayed?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big takeaways that Sun Yat-sen is quite different in different contexts. And so for a time, if you ask people, oh, can you name a Chinese politician? They would have said Sun Yat-sen in the US, or they would have said Chiang Kai-shek. And Sun Yat-sen was internationally famous, especially after 1898, after his London kidnapping affair, which is quite the story. Maybe we can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Before we get into that, to the question I'd asked, because that's a really interesting story, and I know you've told me about that when we were sitting in my office a couple of times. He was kidnapped. Like, why was he so controversial that he needed to be kidnapped?
Well, there's a lot of converging interests, I think, that result in his kidnapping. And there were questions of, well, was he actually kidnapped, or did he throw himself valiantly into the fires of the Qing penal system, which, knowing how Sun Yat-sen was constantly on the run and on the lam, I don't think it's very likely. But J.Y. Wong has a great book on this called The Origins of a Heroic Image. And he really parses out the details of this. And what he says is that, so Sun Yat-sen, by this point, he was pretty much he was on the lam, and if he was caught, he would be sentenced to death for his role in subverting the states. The first Guangzhou uprising was quite literally an attempt to overthrow the government of Guangzhou. it was an act of treason against the Qing government, and they would treat it as such. And traitors had a way of being strangled to death in China or being beheaded. Those are your two options generally. And so Sun Yat-sen naturally doesn't want this to happen. And so he tries to avoid China, and he doesn't set foot in China after the first Guangzhou Uprising for quite some time. He goes to Taiwan, he goes to all sorts of places. But he's not back on mainland China for years. But when he makes it to London, he had just been fundraising in the United States. And he had taken a coast-to-coast tour. He landed in San Francisco, met with the Tongs there. I think went up to Vancouver in Canada. And then he's riding the rails out east. He's stopping every city along the way. He's stopping in Denver, the city of gold. He's stopping in Kansas City, St. Louis. I think he makes it to Chicago. He makes it to Philly. And his final port of entry his port of departure is New York. And supposedly, when he's in New York, word is sent to London that Sun Yat-sen, a wanted rebel, is coming to London. I'm not too sure how exactly this was known, because you didn't really need passports to travel at this time. You didn't need visas. It was a very different way of traveling, especially to go to Britain. You didn't need a passport to go to Britain at that point.
Mm.
And so Sun Yat-sen just hops on a steamer from New York to Liverpool. And he is going to meet his old teacher from the Hong Kong Medical College. This guy, Dr. James Cantley, who was a doctor who specialized in leprosy down at the Tropical Medicine College there. And he had actually met Cantley and his wife on their way back to London when he was in Honolulu on his way to fundraise in San Francisco. And so from the sound of it, the Cantleys invited Sun, say, "Oh, well, if you're ever in Britain, ring us up, we'll host you." And Sun took them up on their offer. He made it to Britain, he went to London, and the Cantleys helped him find housing. And so he ends up finding housing by one of the Inns of Court, Gray's Place. And the Inn of Court is where they train barristers in Britain. So it's like a law school. So it's surrounded by student housing. And so he's staying at one of these essentially student housing blocks outside of the law school. And he likes to go to the Cantleys very often. He walks there almost every day. And he's not exploring other parts of the city. And whenever he would walk from his place over to the Cantleys, he'd always pass the Chinese legation in London on Portland Place by, I think, the Oxford Circus. And supposedly, one of the people in the legation, it's not clear, I don't quite remember the details, if the legation received word from New York, if they knew what Sun looked like, I don't think they did. But one of the stories is this guy in the legation, Deng Ting-kang, was from Xiangshan. So he knew the dialects. And I suppose that they were suspicious of this guy constantly walking to and fro in front of the Chinese legation. And so one day he goes and he starts talking to Sun Yat-sen, who doesn't know it's Sun Yat-sen, in Xiangshanese. And Sun responds. And so this increased their suspicion that this might be someone they were looking for. They heard word of a famous Xiangshanese revolutionary coming to London. And here's this guy in a time where there aren't a lot of Chinese in London. And most of the Xiangshanese who emigrated went to Honolulu, really. It was, chain migration. And so they end up detaining him. They bring him up to the third floor of the Chinese legation. They lock him in a room, and they interrogate him. I mean, they're not like beating him or anything, but he's locked in a room. He can't leave. They supposedly try to give him all sorts of food, but he refuses to eat anything aside from milk, raw egg, and bread. And he's just sitting there for days on end. He's locked in this room. But there's a window, and there's this porter named George Cole. And George Cole was not really sympathetic to Sun. He didn't really care. He was there for his paycheck. So Sun ends up bribing George Cole to deliver a message to James Cantley and to one of his other former professors at the Hong Kong Medical College, I think Dr. Samuel Manson. And so Mrs. Cantley gets a message from George Cole's wife about this guy, Sun Yat-sen. I think it was spelled like Sun Yat-sen, though, who was locked at the Chinese legation. And so James Cantley springs into action when he hears of this from his wife. He ends up talking to what is it in Britain? I think it's the Foreign Office. He ends up talking to the Foreign Office. He ends up talking to Scotland Yard, and they start trying to defuse the situation. Scotland Yard is investigating into his whereabouts and what to do about it. And the Foreign Office is trying to communicate with Beijing. And it turns into an international incident eventually, once the British press gets word of it. Because one thing that James Cantley did is he sort of spread rumors about Sun Yat-sen, including that he might be from Hong Kong, which would make him a subject of the crown.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, there was a British subject being detained by the Chinese legation to be executed in China.
Yeah.
Because they were going to bring him over to China and execute him back in the homeland to answer for his crimes against the Qing court. And so eventually the situation is diffused not before the name of Halliday Macartney, who was one of the employees of the Chinese legation. It was an interesting figure in his own right, is thoroughly dragged through the mud by the British press. And the whole thing turns into an enormous, black eye for the Qing presence in London. Really makes them look pretty bad. And it turns into a cause célèbre. And so Sun Yat-sen and James Cantley, who was effectively his press manager at this point, really roll with it when Sun gets out. In his press conferences, he releases a book. He's living his 15 minutes of fame in London. And it's quite it's the formative experience really for this failed revolutionary. Really, he had been a rebel. There wasn't a sort of grand movement behind his rebellion or his attempted rebellion in Guangzhou. There was no real ideology. There wasn't a grand story or narrative. It was just the Qing are bad and we're going to overthrow them. And we're going to start here. But in London, this is one of Wong's main points, and Mary Claire Bergère, another good biographer of Sun Yat-sen, both make the argument that this is really where Sun Yat-sen he becomes described as a revolutionary. This also happened in Japan thanks to one of his friends, Chen Xiaobai, who was in Kobe. But this is when the Western press first gets whiff of Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary. And Sun ends up essentially transforming his image, transforming his conduct to fit this new Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary of China. Mm-hmm. He emphasizes his time in the West. He emphasizes his understanding of Christian faith, of democracy, and of the liberal arts and of modern governance.
Do you think that boosted his image, that he had that Christian background, that he lived in Hawaii, that he traveled around the US and Canada? Was that a factor that enhanced his popularity, do you think?
To whom? The Brits?
To the British, to the West in general, when they wrote about Sun Yat-sen as the revolutionary.
I think it did. I think that was very important. And I think that is also one reason why Chiang Kai-shek also becomes a Christian at some points. Mm-hmm. But that's moving into a different topic. Mm-hmm. But one thing that's very clear, I think, from Sun and from his works, especially the works edited by Cantley, the first one is Kidnapping in London, which is allegedly by Sun Yat-sen and probably is partly by him. But it's clearly written by Cantley, or at the very least edited with a heavy hand by Cantley. Mm-hmm. And there's a later book called Sun Yat-sen and the Awakening of China, printed on the occasion of Sun assuming the office of president, which is also written by Cantley. This time it's officially written by Cantley and this other guy. But Cantley does all the stuff involving Sun Yat-sen. The other guy does this sort of Orientalist miscellany about China, Here's a history of the dynasties. Here's what the Chinese look like. Here are some of their beliefs, that sort of thing. Sort of contextualize Sun Yat-sen and China for the British reader who may not know much about either at the time. Mm-hmm. But one of the things about the London kidnapping is that it made Sun Yat-sen seem very dangerous. It made him seem like he really had a cause behind him, when really he was a dime a dozen failed rebel in the time, in the late Qing. That there were many of these people around, and he wasn't necessarily anything special at this point. But the kidnapping and the aftermath are sort of the springboard for Sun to move forward as a revolutionary leader, especially and to establish an international image.
Yeah. So I mean, one thing that comes to my mind when you tell this story is that it's his kidnapping was in a way sort of a fault of his own. Like he was the one constantly walking by the this diplomatic building. Like was he hoping to provoke the people working inside? Like what was do we have an insight into his mind of like what was he hoping to achieve by approaching this building all the time?
Well, that's actually a very interesting question, and there's two things that we should really talk about for that. There's two versions of this story. One is the kidnapping in London story, which is the official story. That's the one that Sun Yat-sen wrote in his name with the help
Mm-hmm.
of Cantley and promulgated throughout the world. And that is that Sun Yat-sen was minding his own business when he was kidnapped by those dastardly Chinese in the legation. You know, those absolute slaves of the Qing emperor and their, real despicable English servants, Halliday Macartney. Halliday Macartney was Scottish, but you get the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there's this other story that Sun Yat-sen allegedly told Hu Hanmin and Dai Jital, which is that he intentionally walked into the legation to make a point and to preach, the mission of the national revival to people inside the legation. Because the legation wasn't just government employees; there were also, travelers and passerby
Mm-hmm.
and Chinese just kind of happening to mill about in there. I guess it was more of a social scene than you would expect at a government building. Not a lot of people hanging out at the DMV, but I guess it was sort of a meeting place too. But also, and this is one of the big things that supports the first interpretation, which is the interpretation that J.Y. Wong goes with, is that he had a very good reason to be walking this route. I mean, it wasn't the best route to walk if you're a wanted revolutionary or a wanted rebel, you know. But at the same time, it's a major road on the way between his place of lodging and his host's home. So there was a reason for him to be walking the route, and there was a reason for him to be walking it frequently. Now, was it smart to walk that route? Clearly not. He got kidnapped. It was not
Yeah.
a very smart route to walk.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's one reason why he invents this other story, which is that, it's sort of a stupid story if that's really how it happened. Oh,
Yeah.
why were you walking by the Chinese legation every single day? That's sort of
Yeah.
tempting fate. But it's much more noble, it's much more inspiring if the leader of the revolution walks into the lion's den
Mm-hmm.
and preaches to the lions this new revolutionary creed. That's inspiring, that's selfless, that's daring.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the story that he tells most people. He only tells it to a couple of people. They verify it. You might wonder, well, Dai Jitao, Hu Hanmin, do they possibly have a motivation in inventing this story and just saying, oh yeah, we heard this story from him because we're really on the inside with him. And, Sun Yat-sen and connections to Sun Yat-sen were quite valuable during his lifetime and after his lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
But if he did tell the story, and it's not altogether implausible, Sun Yat-sen told lots of stories, then it possibly is a way to save face almost.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting to think that you know someone who's considered now the father of the nation, Guofu, was potentially almost born out of coincidence. Like it's sort of an interesting and kind of jarring thing to think about.
And now that you brought up Guofu, that's actually it's a
Yeah.
very interesting term, the father of the nation.
Actually, yeah, I did want to ask that, but I guess first, do you want to like finish the chronology of his life and then we'll get into that term? Yeah. So yeah, after his kidnapping, so then what happens?
Well, then he enters another phase of milling about, revoluting, and failing to revolute. And that's actually really the story, because this happens in 1898. He leaves Britain in 1899, but he does see the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And this is something that J.Y. Wong speculates was one of the origins of his focus on national spirits. Because he sees this festival. This is unlike anything we've ever seen. This is unlike any British people today will ever see. This was Britain, the imperial power of the world, celebrating the Diamond Jubilee of one of their longest reigning monarchs, the Empress of India. This was a real, this was a real to-do. This was real pageantry. And it was apparently quite the impression, or it left quite the impression on Sun Yat-sen, because he apparently would always refer, or at least on some level, would have this in mind when he thought about national spirits. This is what national spirit looks like, and this is what China lacks. And that is why China is in the state it is today, and why it's not like Britain. And so it's not a major event, but it does have ramifications in his thought later on. But more to the point, after he leaves Britain, he bounces around a bit. He goes to Japan. He's organizing uprisings from Taiwan, from Japan. Gets booted out of Japan at one point. Leaves behind an illicit wife. Goes to Singapore. Gets banned from Singapore. Goes to Penang. Gets banned from Penang. Goes to the US again to fundraise again. And this essentially brings us up through 1911. When he's on the train once again, going west to east, on the train from Denver to either Kansas City or St. Louis. Either way, I mean, you pass through Kansas City on the way to St. Louis if you're taking the train, or the highway for that matter today. And he looks at the paper on the train, and he sees that there has been an uprising in Wuchang, which is now one of the cities that comprise modern-day Wuhan, a city of some notoriety lately.
Right, a very notable city lately.
Yes. And at the time, It was called the Wuhan Tri-Cities. It wasn't one city. It would only become one city in 1927. And so in Wuchang, there was a new army unit. The new army being a Qing modernization attempt, an attempt to westernize and modernize their military. And this new army unit, essentially, it seized the government buildings at Wuchang, and it declared an insurrection. It declared a rebellion. And this rebellion would cascade throughout the provinces of China. And it would lead to what is known today as the Sinha Revolution, which would succeed. But Sun Yat-sen and his revolutionary organization, the Tongmenghui, did not actually organize this. They organized all sorts of uprisings, they had all sorts of connections, but they did not organize the Wuchang uprising. But regardless, Sun Yat-sen emerges. He comes back. He comes back from Britain to serve as the president of the Republic, or the provisional president of the Republic. And this is a post he holds for only about 2.5 to 3 months, from January of 1912 to about March. And this was a remarkable series of failures for the Republicans. This was at the time of the first legislature, the first Republican parliament. This was at a time when Song Jiaoren, the leader of the Kuomintang, gets assassinated, purportedly by Yuan Shikai, probably by Yuan Shikai, but I don't know if we know the actual details on who specifically killed Song Jiaoren. But this was a time when Yuan Shikai essentially usurps power from the new Republican government and reestablishes his hold, and essentially preserves the structure of the Qing Empire. He moves the capital from Nanjing back up to Beijing. And he actually tries to crown himself a new emperor and to found the new dynasty, which fails. It fails terribly. And he dies shortly after doing this.
He died in 1916, right?
Yeah, 1916 or so.
Right.
And so this was before, this is actually important. So after Yuan Shikai usurps power, Sun Yat-sen goes back to Japan, and he tries to lead a second revolution against Yuan Shikai, but this fails. But it's in Japan that he meets his latest wife, Song Qingling, who was the daughter of one of his good friends, Charlie Song, who was a Christian Bible printer and businessman and conglomerate owner and mill owner in Shanghai. And Charlie Song is also a very interesting figure. He was educated at a boarding school in North Carolina somehow. He was like a Lascar on a ship to Boston, and the captain liked him, brought him down to North Carolina, and he learns all sorts of things. He goes back to Shanghai as a minister, and then becomes a businessman. And he was absolutely appalled that his good friend, who was already married, who already had a concubine, though he didn't tell about the concubine, Chen Sui-fun. That was known to his wife, Lu Mujun. That was known to his brother, Sun Mei. I don't think Charlie Song knew about Chen Sui-fun. And he's trying to marry his daughter. He's the same age as he is. He's 30 years older than his daughter. He's not a big fan.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
It's pretty an understandable reaction. But
Right.
regardless, love conquers all, and Song Qingling flees Shanghai. She absconds from her family's clutches, goes back to Japan to elope with Sun Yat-sen, who nominally divorces Lu Mujun. And Charlie Song and Sun Yat-sen don't really talk anymore after that.
Yeah.
But after the failure of the Second Revolution, Sun Yat-sen bounces around a bit more. Eventually, he makes his way to Shanghai. And this is interesting because this is around the time of the May 4th movement. And so he tries to establish a military government in Guangzhou. He fails. He goes to Shanghai after failing. And in Shanghai, he spends some time, writing, thinking, reading. But he doesn't really engage with the May 4th movement at all. He doesn't really comment on it. And this is interesting for someone who was ostensibly very revolutionary, because his writings were actually quite traditional in tone at this time. He writes a lot about Chinese morality. He writes a lot about the beneficial aspects of Confucian political structure, that sort of thing. This is not very much in line with the new culture movement, And the new culture movement, for those who are unaware, was this movement essentially to throw out everything that was Chinese about China, or that was old about China, and everything that was feudal about China, so that China could modernize. We need to destroy the remnants of our feudal culture.
Right, and this carries over in. Right, and this carries over into Mao's theory of overthrowing, for example, Confucian ideas and values.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yes, we see many echoes of this in the Destroy the Four Olds movements in the Cultural Revolution. And I'd argue you still hear echoes of it in other corners of the world through the present day. But that's a topic for another time, perhaps.
Yeah.
But the big thing here is that after his little vacation in Shanghai, he goes back to Guangzhou to found another government. And he's betrayed by his general, Chen Zhongming. And it leads to this daring escapade where he flees to the river, where a riverboat with Chiang Kai-shek is waiting for him. Chiang Kai-shek being the commandant of the Whampoa Academy. Although perhaps I'm getting my dates mixed up here.
And let me just interject and say again, for those who don't know, Chiang Kai-shek was a very important figure in the Republic of China, and he was actually the one that ultimately evacuated himself and his government to Taiwan, and he'd become the first leader of the Republic of China in Taiwan in 1949. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there.
It's very important context. And we're going to be talking a bit about him once we finally make it to the legacies of Sun Yat-sen. We're still, it's hard to encapsulate a life in 45 minutes, but I think we're doing a pretty good job so far.
No, we got time. Take your time.
The big thing with this episode is that Sun Yat-sen is made painfully aware of the inadequacies of his political clouds. His military is not loyal to him. His mercenaries are not loyal to him. Chen Zhongming was questionably loyal. Clearly he was not. Then his mercenaries were obviously not loyal. That was just, they're mercenaries. You pay them. They'll protect you if it's worth their time and if it's worth your dollar. There's no such thing as loyalty. And Sun Yat-sen is painfully aware of this after what happens is his presidential palace is on the hillside just outside the city of Guangzhou. Chen Zhongming's troops set up artillery at the top of the hillside. They're bombarding it from the top of the hill. It's really over the top. It's beyond an assassination attempt. It's a declaration of war on a single house. And it has consequences. Song Qingling was pregnant. She miscarries. She can never get pregnant again. That's it for her. And it's a tough time for Sun Yat-sen and Song Qingling. And what happens is after escaping this wreckage, he accepts Soviet aid. This big world event, the Soviet Union now exists, and it is in a bit of a pickle. It's being invaded in what's called the Siberian Intervention. The Japanese are invading. The Entente is invading. They're trying to restore Imperial Russia. Now, they're not trying all that hard to restore it, mind you, but they'd rather have the Tsar around because at least they know how to work with the Tsar. They don't like these Bolsheviks too much. They find them frightening.
Right.
And these Bolsheviks are winning, but they are also aware that they need friends. They need friends, and they don't have any. And who would be a better friend than China? China is also it's a country that's had some problem with the Entente powers, with the great powers of the 19th century. It's had some problems with Japan, and they share a border. So perhaps a deal could be struck. China and Russia could perhaps work together. And so there's all sorts of negotiations, and what comes out of it is the Sun Yat Accords, which were signed between Sun Yat-sen and this guy, I think Abraham Yaf was his name. And what the Accords say is that it's not the time for communist revolution in China. It's the time for capitalist revolution in China. It's the time for the bourgeoisie to form the state and to build up the capitalist economy. And the Soviet Union is willing to aid them to this end because this is historically progressive. The narrative being that China was still in the age of feudalism.
Right, and then they go to capitalism and then socialism and ultimately communism.
Yes, that's the idea. And so you might think, oh, well, that's a bit odd that the communists are helping these avowed capitalists. But that's how they're thinking. This is progressive. This is, today we help the capitalists. Tomorrow we can help the socialists. And then we'll have some communist buddies when the final utopia arrives.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the idea. And in any case, having a friendly government to your south would make things a lot easier for the Soviet Union. So even if they're not good socialists, maybe you don't care that much. You can use their warm water ports. They have manpower, you have resources. You can make a deal. And so the Soviet Union essentially restructures Sun Yat-sen's party, which at this point, it was the Tongmenghui that sort of dissolved and that reformed into the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang dissolves. It's reformed in a couple of ways, and now it's finally reorganized as the party that we'll know for decades, which is the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Zhonghua Kuomintang. And so this is a Leninist party with the ambition of becoming a Leninist party state. It is designed according to the same principles as the Bolsheviks. It's the same design that the Chinese Communist Party will use, really. And it's an enormous, enormous party. It grows and grows and grows. And it's militarized. You're not dealing with mercenaries anymore. You have your own private army trained by Soviet advisors at the Whampoa Academy, which is where Sun Yat-sen, who was the officer on the boats, now he's the commandant of Whampoa. And he is a rapidly rising star in the Kuomintang. Mind you still have your old stars. You have Wong Jing Wei, who we talked about earlier. We have Hu Hanmin, who reappears in the story periodically. You have Liao Zhongkai, and you have He Xiangning. You have all sorts of people. It's an enormous party. But what happens is that it's so big that it's really hard to control or really focus the party's energies on anything. And Sun Yat-sen had lots of trouble with this, so he was trying to provide an ideological platform for the Kuomintang. And so in the final years of his life, which obviously he didn't know would be the final years of his life, he's delivering these lectures on the three people's principles. And these are principles he's been talking about for years, but now he's finally codifying them. This is what they mean. This is exactly what they mean. Here are some lectures telling you exactly what I think we need to do. And so there are three principles, namely the principle of nationalism, Minzuzhui, is the principle of democracy, or the people's sovereignty, depending on which translation you look at, which is Minquanju. And then there's the principle of the people's welfare, which is Min Shengzui. And the last one is the most controversial because he died before he finished his lecture on the principle of the people's welfare. And so the communists say, this principle of the people's welfare is socialism. He's just a half-baked socialist, and that is how we'll remember him. Whereas if you're not so socialist-minded, you'll say, oh, he wasn't a socialist. He was simply concerned with the excesses of capitalism, and so sought to bring the excellence of traditional Chinese culture to ameliorate some of the excesses. He read Henry George, he read all sorts of people. And so he was trying to design a more humane version of national capitalism. But in any case, he dies on his way to negotiate with the northern warlords. China has once again fallen into a series of feuding states, essentially, led by private armies. There's the Anhui clique, there's the Fengtian clique, there's the Guangxi clique.
Right. This is largely considered the warlord era of Chinese history.
And so the Kuomintang is really just a faction of warlords among other warlords at this point. Their base is in southern China, around Guangzhou, specifically in the city of Guangzhou. They control some of the province around. But they're just another warlord faction at this point. They're pretty much on par with the Fengtian clique or any of these other cliques in terms of power and influence. And so Sun Yat-sen goes up to Beijing to negotiate with the warlords, of which he was considered one. And so he dies on the journey. He had cancer, but before he gets there, he stops in Kobe and delivers this speech to the Japanese about the error of their ways, essentially, saying, you are following the way of the hegemon. You are militaristic, you are brutal, and you are willing to squeeze everyone for all they've got if it benefits you. But that's okay. That's the Western way of doing things. You can still return to the kingly way of the East. You can become humane again. You can, focus on righteousness and, kindness, and good dealings with your neighbors. It's not too late to turn around and change your path. And this is something that has really large repercussions for propaganda. Obviously, Japan at this point was a full-fledged imperial power. They would only grow in the next decade. But he makes it to Tianjin. His health pretty much gives out in Tianjin. He goes to Beijing for treatment and dies there. And he's interred in the Western Hills. And that's the end of Sun Yat-sen's life, but that's really just the start of his legacy, which is something that is still being molded today by different people with different interests.
In some ways, he has two lives, and in that second life, he's still alive. So he dies in 1925. He never really gets to see the Republic of China in full before the end of his life, but his image is used, and also a notion of his status is used, and that's guofu, and that's something we talked about a little bit earlier on in the podcast. Do you want to pick it up from there? Do you want to start talking about guofu? First of all, what does that term mean, and why is it so important?
The wolf was a very loaded term with an interesting history. And it comes to supplant calling him by anything else. He had been known as the doctor, as the premier, as Sun Zhongshan without honorifics, and many other things. But starting in the 1940s, he becomes guofu. He becomes the father of the nation. It leads to very awkward turns of phrase in some of his biographies, including this one by Jiang Dexiang, who was a biographist of the late 1930s, 1940s. And in a wartime biography he uses this very odd phrase, the father of the nation was the benevolent mother of the republic. And, this really contrived phrase. But one thing about the guofu phrase is that it only really comes into full force after the start of the Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War. And in particular, after the foundation of the reorganized Republic of China, headed by Wong Jing Wei. And so guofu, the mantle of the father of the nation, really is it's a product of the propaganda war between Chiang Kai-shek and Wong Jing Wei, because both had very strong claims to Sun. and both really needed him to back their side for political legitimacy. Because if you look at it on the surface, this is just another one of many Kuomintang power feuds. There had been one in the early 30s with Hu Hanmin starting a separatist government in Guangzhou. There had been one between Chiang Kai-shek and Wong Jing Wei, with Chiang establishing a rival government at Nanjing, opposed to the official government based at Wuhan. And so really this was par for the course for Kuomintang politics. But now the stakes were higher because it was in the context of a really disastrous war. The war, just to clarify, it was a complete mess for China by 1938 when Wang Jing Wei defected. The Chinese had lost pretty much all of East China. They lost all of their ports. Everything aside from maybe Wenzhou, which is a small port. It's not really good for access to the interior. Mm-hmm. And even the retreat was bungled. The Chinese returned to environmental warfare but drowned hundreds of thousands of their own citizens. They burned the city of Changsha to deny it to the Japanese. They retreated all the way to Sichuan, and it was a real mess. And so when Wang defects, Chiang needs something. He needs a win. He needs something to prop himself up and to make him appear.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to interrupt for one moment to interject. So for people who aren't aware, the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, so again, this is a very chaotic time, even when the Kuomintang is in power. The Chinese Civil War begins in 1927, and then there's a brief intermission where both the communists and the nationalists agree to sort of set each other their differences and work together against the Japanese, who initiate war in 1937. Sorry, I keep stopping because I wasn't sure if you were breaking up or not. But so anyway, the Japanese invasion of port cities such as Shanghai began in 1937, and so this sort of further adds to the chaos in this period. So I just wanted to interject and throw that in there for context.
Certainly. And just for further context on the military action, it's even messier than that. I mean, you could make the argument that the Civil War starts with the decline of the Manchu Qing Empire in 1911. Right. And it doesn't really end ever. It doesn't really end. It's just sort of constant, warlord cliques. The Kuomintang kind of wins, not really. And the communists are active, and they kind of lose, but not really. It flares up again and again, as so often, internal instability does. It's not necessarily big battles like Antietam or something. It's often little guerrilla bands in the mountains sniping people, setting up tolls and whatnot. And so the Japanese, this is a big thing for Wang Jing Wei and Chiang Kai-shek. The Japanese also invaded Manchuria in 1931. They seized Manchuria. They seized Rehe province in 1932. They tried to seize Chahar province. They invaded Shanghai in 1932 and bombed Nanjing. The war that's one of the difficult things about this war. There's not very clear boundaries, which goes to show you just how unstable the period was and how difficult it was to establish any sense of order. But in any case, so the communists and Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang are based at Chongqing. They form the Second United Front. They're more united in name than in reality. There's still some fighting between the two, but for the most part, they cooperate. Though there are all sorts of concerns on the parts of the communists that the nationalists are holding back their forces to wait for the resumption of active hostilities between them. There's all sorts of suspicions from the Second United Front's nationalist side that the communists are seizing the opportunity to seize lands for themselves, and to essentially radicalize the population against the national government, which is still the Nanjing-based, or formerly Nanjing-based KMT government. And then you have Wang Jing Wei, who is making the argument that this war is a disaster. It's all in the name of vanity. It's in the name of Chiang Kai-shek preserving his own political power. And it's in the name of Soviet imperialism, with its agents, the Chinese communists, trying to seize land in China. And at the time, that's not necessarily an outrageous claim to make. That's not necessarily, out of the blue. And that's part of the reason why we see this turn to the father of the nation. They need to establish their patriotic credentials. Chiang Kai-shek needs to show that no, he is the descendant. He is the heir of the national revolution. He was the right-hand man of this, sort of incredible man, this superhuman figure, Sun Yat-sen, an uncommon man of uncommon vision and uncommon values, who we should all emulate, and who we should revere. And naturally, since Chiang Kai-shek is the next Sun Yat-sen, we should also revere him and listen to him. And for Wong Jing Wei, it's a bit different. Sun Yat-sen is also the father of the nation for the Nanjing regime. But instead of being the sort of superhuman figure, he's more of a well-intentioned, far-sighted visionary, with more of a focus on his Asian credentials than his strictly nationalist credentials. It's not so much, Sun Yat-sen was a great Chinese revolutionary. That was part of the rhetoric. But there was more to it for Wong, because he needed to legitimate Japanese involvement in the war. He was trying to legitimate entry into the Japanese order, the new order of the Japanese Empire, and what was called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. So this is a lot of heavy lifting, in terms of ideology. This is something that isn't necessarily easy to sell. And so he needs someone with really good credentials to back him on this. And that someone is Sun Yat-sen. We talked about his Kobe speech earlier. Wang Jing Wei brings up all sorts of things, like all the Japanese collaborators he had. There were people who died in the revolution, fighting for Sun Yat-sen, fighting for China, who were Japanese. And Wang Jing Wei milks them for all they're worth. And it's really part of this power struggle. And so after Wang Jing Wei dies and the reorganized government collapses, there's no real threat from anyone else in the party. Chiang Kai-shek is the leader. Now, he absconds for a bit, so he doesn't stain his hands with losing the mainland. Technically, that was Li Zongren that lost the mainland. But, Chiang Kai-shek had the knack for stepping out at the right time and coming back when it was more pleasant, or coming back when it was more convenient. But he's still at the helm, really. He's still at the helm. And he still holds on to this image of the national father, the father of the nation, because he needs to legitimate his regime. And part of the challenge that Taiwan, he's really left with Taiwan and like the marshes of coastal Fujian province. Taiwan had not been Chinese for a while. It had been colonized by the Japanese pretty thoroughly since 1895. And even before that, it was a very parochial province. It was not even a province. It was only a province starting in the 1880s. Before that, it was a prefecture of Fujian. The Chinese, the Qing court did not put any money into Taiwan until the 1880s. They didn't really care. It became sort of a problem for them in the mid-19th century with increased interest from foreign powers. It had led to this investment. But before that, they really did not care that much. It was not worth their attention. It was not worth their time. And so Taiwan was not really brought into the fold in the same way, let's say, Henan was, or Guangdong was, or even the northwestern provinces, which are their own sources of controversy. And so there's this real contentious claim to make that Sun Yat-sen is the father of your nation, you Taiwanese people. You are Chinese, and I am the heir to the father of the nation, and therefore I'm essentially the new father of the nation. I am the great leader, and you should listen to me because I'm backed by Sun Yat-sen, by his revolutionary ideals, and by the party he founded. And so there was this big Sinicization campaign in Taiwan as a result. And then a later chapter, I deal with Taiwan and some of the particulars of that memory space for Sun Yat-sen. But the gist for the Kuomintang, it goes like this. He becomes the father of the nation as part of a propaganda war between Chiang Kai-shek and Wong Jing Wei. And it's an all-consuming propaganda war that's not really decided by words. It's decided by the stalling Japanese advance, by the American entry into the war, and the collapsing fortunes of the reorganized governments. But the propaganda war is a very important part of the war.
So anyone that goes to Taipei, or anyone that goes to Nanjing now, I believe you said you've been to the Sun Yat-sen Memorial in Taipei, but not the one in Nanjing, if I remember
Yes.
correctly. Anyone who goes there will find something interesting that both of these cities, and I guess for people who aren't too familiar, um, without getting too deeply into this very complicated and sticky topic, people in Taiwan consider themselves, for the most part, most people consider themselves to be an independent nation, not a dependency of China, although China considers Taiwan to be a part of the PRC domain. But so there's a lot where Taiwan, especially now, you talk about like a sinification campaign that existed upon Chiang Kai shek's entrance into Taiwan, which certainly was prevalent until you start getting into like the early 90s. And then there starts to become this shift in thinking where now you have a new generation of people who are born in Taiwan. They have no sort of sentimental connection to the mainland. And there starts to become this rethinking of, oh, well, I'm not really Chinese. And they start to form this Taiwanese identity. And, I deal with this a little bit in my MA thesis. But there is one thing. I mean, there's a few things that still hold China and Taiwan in common, but one thing is that they both have statues of Sun Yat-sen. So I guess I don't have a question strictly from it, but sort of jumping off of this idea that they both have these pretty grandiose statues of Sun Yat-sen, what message are China and Taiwan trying to send by having these statues?
Certainly. And this will take us, we'll skip talking about the communists on the mainland for a bit because, well, I guess we'll have to bring them in at some point. But for now, we're going to be talking about the KMT, the Kuomintang, and the mausoleum in Nanjing. We're going to talk a bit about the mausoleum in Taipei, which isn't a mausoleum, rather, it's a memorial hall. That's the key distinction, I think. So the mausoleum in Nanjing is a mausoleum. He is buried there. And this was constructed as a way of consecrating Nanjing as the permanent capital. You can't move it to Beijing anymore because now we have Sun Yat-sen buried here. And Sun Yat-sen had been buried in Beijing. As we recall, he died there. And he was buried in the Western Hills. And the moving of his corpse, his remains, to Nanjing was a big propaganda event. There's a train with his face on it. Wherever it stopped in town, um, Kuomintang officials and soldiers will get off the train to tell people about the father of the nation, Sun Yat-sen, and why they should care that his corpse is passing through the area. So this was a real way to expose people to the father of the nation. Though, as we know, he wasn't quite the father of the nation yet. He was simply a revered figure that was sometimes called the father of the nation, but he wasn't legally. In the 1940s, he legally became the father of the nation. But the corpse moves to Nanjing, and consecrating this tomb is very important. It's a real propaganda moment for the Kuomintang. They bring Song Qingling back from Europe. Chiang Kai-shek tries to, escort her to the tomb since she is the widow of Sun Yat-sen, and she rejects him. Song Qingling had been living in the Soviet Union and had fled after the collapse of the Wuhan government. And she was not keen on Chiang Kai-shek, who she suspected of having married into the family. He married her sister, Song Mei-lin, just for her money and connections, which was perhaps part of the story. Chiang Kai-shek did have an knack for things like that. But the gist is, this tomb was not just an important propaganda moment in the sense that you can have a spectacle. This tomb is in the Purple Mountains of Nanjing. That's where the first Ming emperor is buried, the Hongwu emperor. And the Ming dynasty is very important in Chinese nationalism because it's the last Han dynasty. The Qing was a Manchu dynasty, a dynasty of foreign conquerors, barbarians from the northern steppes, coming in, taking the country by storm, and imposing their rule on it and humiliating the Chinese, forcing them to wear queues and things. And it became sinicized over time. And obviously, the actual story of the Ming-Qing transition is more complicated than that. Hong Taiji tried to have the image of a Confucian ruler. Their Hachi tried to be beneficent, that sort of thing. But this narrative that we must expel the Tartars, which was the derisive name for the Manchus, expel the barbarians, this sort of diseased and quote unquote retarded race, unfit for the modern world, from China. We must establish a new China. This was Sun Yat-sen. There's a lot of anti-Manchuism in there, which is one reason you might find it funny when you think that Sun Yat-sen is invoked as a leader. One of the quotes you see on the statues in the US is "all are equal." Sun Yat-sen did not think all were equal.
Mhm.
He had a notion of Kantian inequality where some people are physically better than others. You have people who are losers, you have people who are winners. Okay, that's just how it is. He also really hated the Manchus. It was like sort of an ethnic hatred, but perhaps it's oversimplifying things. That was not rare in the late 19th century in China. It was not necessarily ethnic hatred, but it smacks of it when you encounter it. But the big thing, once again, is this is connecting the Ming Dynasty to the new nationalist states. Sun Yat-sen is buried next to the Hongwu Emperor. The founder of the last Han Dynasty is buried next to the founder of the new Chinese Republic. That's very big. That's very important. And that's one reason why the Nanjing Mausoleum is a mausoleum. And that's one reason why when Wang died, his corpse was interred just outside the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum. There was a new mausoleum built right next to it for Wong Jing Wei. And when Chiang Kai-shek retook Nanjing, he had it destroyed with artillery. Because this was a complete affront to Chiang Kai-shek. This was a complete disgrace to his understanding of the nation, having this traitor buried there. And actually, Chiang Kai-shek and Wang Jing Wei were compatriots. They worked a lot together. But if Wang Jing Wei is allowed to be buried there, that means he's a legitimate heir. And so it's simply unallowable. And I assume if Chiang Kai-shek had it his way, he would probably have been entombed there himself. But that's obviously he lost the mainland. He can't do that.
Right,
There
yeah.
is talk
History
about
turned out
having,
differently.
yeah, things didn't work out as planned. But there is talk sometimes about having his remains interred at Sukho in Ningbo, which is where his family was actually from. But that hasn't happened yet. He's still interred in Taoyuan. But that's the Nanjing Mausoleum. The Taipei Memorial Hall was built in 1972, I think. And it's interesting because it was built as part of the Chinese Cultural Renaissance movement in Taiwan, this active attempt to reconstruct Chinese culture in Taiwan as it was under assault by the communists and the great proletarian cultural revolution in China. And so it was built in a classical style. If you ever see, it's very grand, sweeping eaves, it's red, it has a yellow roof. And inside, there's always a martial guard guarding the statue of Sun Yat-sen, who was a sort of angry-looking man who looks very stern, sitting in a throne, almost like Abraham Lincoln. But Abraham Lincoln doesn't look so mean. And Chiang Kai-shek in his own memorial hall in Taipei is actually smiling if you look at him. And there isn't the same display. At Chiang Kai-shek, there isn't a changing of the guard where they stomp around with bayonets flashing. But that happens at the Sun Yat-sen home on a regular basis. It's an announced event.
Yeah, and I've seen it. I was actually there during one of the changing of the guards.
Oh, what did you think of it?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I definitely agree with you. I absolutely get an Abraham Lincoln feeling from being in there. Just the way he's sitting, his arms on this very grandiose chair, legs spread, and just his body sitting upright very proudly. I very much got that Abraham Lincoln sense from the statue. So I don't know if it was the architecture of or the design of that statue was inspired by the Lincoln Memorial, but I certainly felt that.
There's an interesting connection actually with a statue in Honolulu at the Daniel K. Inouye Airport. There's a statue that was built 6 years earlier. Or, well, I don't know when the statue was built at the Taipei Memorial Hall. I know that it was dedicated in 1972. And this statue was dedicated in 1966 at the airport. It's the same idea. It's Sun Yat-sen sitting in a throne, looking sternly at the viewer. But he's wearing robes in that statue. The one in Taipei, he's wearing his classic Zhongshan suits, which we in the US generally call a Mao suits or a Mao jacket. But that's not what the Chinese call it generally. It's called a Zhongshansu because he was the one who popularized it. And so Sun Yat-sen in Taipei has a different image than in Nanjing. You're not looking at his dead body. He's nowhere near Taipei. In the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum, not that I've been, and maybe you can talk a bit about that if you've been. But I've seen pictures. There's there's like a stone coffin in a steel chamber, but you don't really see that. What you see is the rotunda with the star of the Kuomintang on top, the star of the Republic. And you go down the staircase, and you're back into the hills. You're back in the mountains, and you're aware that you are in this sort of sacred place, the burial sites of emperors, or at least one emperor. The other Ming emperors were buried in Beijing after the dynasty moved there. But in Taipei, it's different. It's right in the city. You're right on a major thoroughfare. You're right across from a sports stone. There are people walking and like playing games and like buying popsicles and doing things. You're right in the middle of the city. That's because it's supposed to be present in your mind. It's supposed to be present in your life. It's a reminder. And the fact that you need to be reminded is a sign that Sun Yat-sen doesn't have as much inherent cachet. It's the same idea with street corner statues. If you need to be reminded about this person, one, they're clearly pretty important to someone, but they might not be important to you, because if they were that important, why would you need to be reminded so often? Why would you need to see them every day when you walk to work? And that's one of the really important things about the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall. It's on a more shaky foundation than the Nanjing Mausoleum. I don't know about geologically, but we talked a bit about how in Taiwan there's a growing sense of Taiwanese identity, and Zhangzhou Dashi, the political science university in Taiwan, does surveys on this every single year, and do surveys on national identification. And while the majority of Taiwanese, well, there is no real majority opinion at the moment. The plurality of Taiwanese identify as, I believe, solely Taiwanese, the close second being Chinese Taiwanese, that is, culturally Chinese, but not necessarily politically parts of the People's Republic of China. And then there are some people who identify as solely Chinese, but of course they don't identify as the people's citizens of the People's Republic of China generally. They identify as citizens of the Republic of China. These are the few old believers in the old national creed. And they're still there. And that makes for complicated politics in Taiwan, particularly in light of certain consideration of cross-strait relations and international politics between the great powers. But it's one thing to consider that in recent years, the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall, it's not just a memorial hall. There's an art gallery below. They publish books, including books on Taiwanese martyrs, like this guy, Jiang Wei, who they directly compare and connect to Sun Yat-sen repeatedly. They make his love interest, Chen Tian, something of a Song Qingling herself. They make Jiang Wei look a lot like Sun Yat-sen. He was a doctor who became a revolutionary and worked to establish a strong, independent Taiwan, and took great inspiration from his counterpart in China. He tried to assassinate Yuan Shikai. He tried to assassinate the Taisho emperor. And he was a real active organizer in colonial Taiwan. And what we can see from this elevation of Jiang Wei, who was someone you couldn't even talk about in the 1970s in Taiwan, from this sort of persona non grata to this new Sun Yat-sen, to this new revolutionary figure as worthy of emulation and study of Sun Yat-sen, by the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall shows that there's a new attempt to connect Sun Yat-sen directly to Taiwanese national history. And so that's what I write about in that chapter. And there's more to it. But the basic idea is that in order to secure a place for Sun Yat-sen in a changing Taiwanese society, he needs to be connected to new figures. Before he was connected to Chiang Kai-shek, that's a liability now. You don't want to be connected to Chiang Kai-shek. That's a problem. He's thought of as a butcher by a lot of people.
Right, and his memorial at the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial is very controversial depending on who you ask. And for those people who aren't aware of, just I'll very briefly mention in context the White Terror. This is something that People can look up on Wikipedia to get more detail. But if we think about something similar to McCarthyism here in the U.S., this sort of hunt for communists. This was something similar to that, but I think on a much more deadly scale. Like there were many more people who would just disappear in the middle of the night. People who were accused of being communists for political reasons, to throw them under the bus. It was a very scary time politically, and so those deaths are connected to Chiang Kai-shek. And so on the one hand, he is sort of considered this protector from the onslaught of Mao and the communist, the Red Army. But at the same time, it came at the cost of so much bloodshed. So there's a lot of people who feel this conflict where either A, they're not sure how to feel about them, B, they understand the horrible things that he did, but also lean more toward recognizing the good things. And then there's those who lean more toward taking note of the bad things. And so there's very mixed opinion of him. But I would encourage everyone to look up the White Terror on Wikipedia or some source just to read a little more about it.
Some people will call him a foreign military dictator. The people who really don't like him.
Yeah, especially if you're an indigenous Taiwanese person. I mean, he's very much an invader from many of those people's perspectives.
But not even, because then you're getting into an interesting piece of electoral politics. The indigenous Taiwanese generally vote Kuomintang, believe it. And that's a whole nother issue that will take us a bit too far afield. But one thing I do want to mention, I was at the 228 memorial. The 228 memorial being dedicated to a massacre.
Right, February 28th incident. Again, you can look it up on Wikipedia if you want to know more about that.
The basic idea being, this was done by this guy Chun Yi, but Chun Yi was commanded by Chiang Kai-shek. And so the nationalists say, oh, we didn't do it. This was a Chun Yi, he bad guy. Chiang Kai-shek punished him and demoted him, sent him far away. Don't hold that against us. This is just a bad apple. But the people who remember this, Chun Yi's face was crossed out in the memorial book because they had a flip book you could look through for information about the event at the memorial, which is right by the National Taiwan Museum. And the picture of Chiang Kai-shek was also crossed out. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people, it's hard to separate yourself from something like that. And so Chiang Kai-shek is way down with lots of baggage. But Sun Yat-sen isn't, because he's more removed. But at the same time, he's tied to Chiang Kai-shek. He's tied to the Chinese Nationalist Party at a time when a lot of Taiwanese don't think of themselves as very Chinese, at least politically, and don't necessarily want to be lumped in or tied to China. And so Sun Yat-sen is being redefined to be more appealing to new sensibilities in Taiwan, to a more local sensibility. Mm-hmm. And so he may still have a future. Chiang Kai-shek, I think, will always have a future because he is an important part of Taiwan's history, but I don't know if he'll be a revered part of that history. But right. Sun Yat-sen, through this redefinition that the Memorial Hall was pursuing, perhaps he has more of a that's the essence of that chapter.
Right. I want to ask one last question here, just to sort of bring it back to an audience who I know is going to be mostly American or Western in general. In your research, I know in our conversations, you've talked about, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that there's a Sun Yat-sen statue somewhere in New York. I might be wrong about that. I believe you'd mentioned something to that effect. One thing that we've talked about in side conversations when we were both graduate students at UO was that there's this sense that Chinese identity extends beyond the borders of China or beyond the borders of Taiwan. And I've talked about how, there was this Asian mart that I frequented in Eugene. And I remember one time I walked in And I needed some help, and so I walked up to the cashier and I said, "Oh, can you help me find this item?" And she calls back. I don't know if it was to her, husband or whatever, but she's like, "Oh, hey, a foreigner needs your help." And I just found that that's a story that I talk about a lot because I just found it so interesting that here we were in the U.S., we were in Eugene, Oregon, but there was still this sort of us them dichotomy that existed even outside the borders of, I don't know if they were from China or Taiwan, but one of those two places. Um, so what is what is Sun Yat-sen, what does his legacy mean here in the US for immigrants who come from China and who come from Taiwan? Is the message similar or is it different? And if it's different, how does it diverge? And obviously I'm sure there's a plurality of meanings, but in general, what does it mean to those immigrants who are here?
Certainly. So this is a complicated question, especially to answer as someone who is not ethnically Chinese. But from my research, I can get a couple of the particulars at least. And this connects also a bit to the communists who we skipped over, but they'll come up a little bit here. I won't talk too much about them for the interest of time. But the New York statue is a good example because it's the first one I ever saw. It's how I first learned of Sun Yat-sen. And that's how it's supposed to work. That's the point of a statue. You see him again and again, and you wonder, well, who is this person? Why does he have this statue? And he starts to occupy a place in your mind. You start to think he's important. And so it becomes a way of not just acculturating the people around you, but a way of inserting yourself into the cultural fabric of a place, quite literally. You change the geography of the area. And so Sun Yat-sen in New York is interesting because he's one of two statues in Chinatown that are very prominent. The other is of Lin Zexu, who was, I think, the magistrate of Guangzhou during the time of the First Opium War with the British. And that was erected as part of an anti-drug campaign. And so it was thought that Lin Zexu was a good figure for that because, one, it's in Chinatown. So you're recognizing a figure from Chinese history and one recognized often as a nationalist figure. And you're also recognizing an anti-drug figure at a time of the anti-drug campaigns. And so with Sun Yat-sen, we see something a bit different. Sun Yat-sen is more of a timeless nationalist. He's so removed from any one issue that he's more abstract. And that's why you see him in so many different places. It's easier to interpret what he is for your own circumstances. Lin Zexu is very good for drugs, but he's not good if you're not trying to talk about drugs in some way. Same thing with Lei Feng. Lei Feng is perfect for a certain ideology. He's terrible for anything else. But Sun Yat-sen is so many things. He has so many aspects. You can tie him into just about anything with a little work, so long as it's something about Chinese nationalism or Chinese identity. Democracy, sometimes in some sense, is also a very vague term, defined differently in different places. And modernity. And so the New York statue is significant, but what I studied more, because I had the chance to visit, was a set of statues in Honolulu. And I didn't have the chance to visit Malaysia, but I included a section on Penang in Malaysia for a bit of contrast. Because when we think of the overseas Chinese, we're thinking of a global diaspora. This is not just, oh, they came to the US. The Chinese, a lot of them settled in Southeast Asia. They're the Nanjing Chinese. They have their own sort of separate culture of overseas Chinese. And so it's an interesting contrast to compare them to American Chinese. And so in Honolulu, you see different statues from different benefactors. One is the airport statue, which was erected by the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Hawaii Foundation, which is a Chinese American society. But you also have a statue that was donated by the Kaohsiung city government, and Kaohsiung being the largest port in southern Taiwan. So this is a gift from the Republic of China, Taiwan. And this was a gift given in the 1980s. You also have a statue dedicated partly with the help of the Zhongshan City Council. And that is the sister city of Honolulu, Zhongshan, which is in Guangdong Province in the People's Republic of China. And so you're seeing different governments, different interest groups, all converging on the same figure of Sun Yat-sen. They all have something a bit different in mind when they erect a statue to him. And so for the airport statue, there's two dedications. One is in English and one is in Chinese. The English dedication, he sounds something like a French Republican saint. He talks about liberty, equality, brotherhood, humanity, civilization, and kindness and compassion. He's a very saintly figure using familiar terms of rhetoric. In the Chinese dedication, he's identified first and foremost as the father of the nation, and his dates are given in the Mingguo calendar, which is the calendar that sets the founding of the republic as the starting of a new era. And so, it's not 1921, it's the 10th year of the republic. And that's a calendar that's actually still in use in Taiwan. And it's still in use on the statue, and it will forever be in use on the statue. Because it's assumed when you look at the statue, or it was assumed in 1966, if you saw this statue and you spoke Chinese, you would identify him as the father of the nation. That nation that he is the father of is the Republic of China. So the statue makes certain assumptions about him. And it's also sort of, cultivating this idea that he is the father of your nation. Now, there's no mention of this in the English dedication, because it's assumed if you speak English, he's not the father of your nation. Then you would kind of take offense. Mm-hmm. Oh, who is this guy that you're saying is the father of my nation? What is this?
Right. It's certainly it's certainly like an inside joke. Like there's definitely supposed to be a particular audience that it's trying to reach.
Exactly. But it has two faces. One face is for one group, the other face is for the other. And so it's equally trying, because this is an international airport. If you want to go to Hawaii, you have to pass through this airport. There's no other option. And so this is the linchpin of Hawaiian transit. And if you pass through this airport, you're probably going to see the statue. And so they want to capture both audiences. They want to capture the Chinese-speaking audience, assumed to be loyal to the Republic, or that they should be loyal to the Republic, and the English-speaking audience, the Americans, the French, the Japanese tourists, And so that's the assumption that there's a couple of assumptions that the statue is working with. But there are other statues, like the one actually by the first meeting place of the Xinzhonghui, which was Sun Yat-sen's first revolutionary group that he founded in Hawaii. And this is the statue donated by Gaoxiu. And in this statue, he is reading a book. And he's standing a bit across the creek, the Nuanu Creek, I think on Bertelsen Way, from a Philippine revolutionary named Jose Rizal. And so this is a lot of people of Filipino descent in Hawaii, so that's a nod to the Filipino community. But here is Sun Yat-sen holding a book, wearing a lei. People put on leis, I guess the plastic ones, fairly often. It looked fairly clean when I was there. And so that's showing a bit of active maintenance on the part of the community. And he's standing on a new base that was dedicated by this foundation headed by Lily's son, who is from a different branch of the Sun family. And so that's part of a family dispute, actually, with which foundation donates which statue or which plinth. And this plinth is emblazoned with Confucian virtues. And so it casts Sun, instead of being sort of a Republican saint, he's now a Confucian sage. He's talking about benevolence, about finding the meaning of things, grasping the essence of things. He's talking about benevolence, righteousness, and trustworthiness. And this is a very different image of Sun Yat-sen. Now, mind you, the original statue didn't have this plinth. This is a new plinth. The original statue stood directly on the white sun and blue star of the Guomindang, of the Republic of China. Now, that is still emblazoned in the sidewalk because it was set there in colored concretes that will be there for as long as the sidewalk remains. But now this new statue of Confucian Sun Yat-sen is standing, with this new plinth that adds new things. And I've seen this plinth elsewhere. It's elsewhere in Honolulu. I saw it in Seattle. I assume it's elsewhere beyond that. And then you have this other statue, which is the Gateway Park statue. And Gateway Park was renamed Sun Yat-sen Park, I think in 2007. I'm not quite clear on the dates. And that was part of a community revitalization effort for the Honolulu Chinatown. So the community wanted this. And the mayor, this guy Mufi Hanaman, thought that this would also be a good way of honoring the sister city relationship with Zhongshan City, because they had been sister cities for about 10 years at that point. And so there's this international dimension to honoring Sun Yat-sen, but there's also this very local dimension too. The people of China, did I mention what this statue looks like?
No.
This statue is of Sun Yat-sen as a schoolboy holding his books going to class. This is a statue that makes sense nowhere but Honolulu. Because he went to school there, he learned his formative lessons about the world there. And so this statue establishes a special relationship between Sun Yat-sen and Hawaii. It makes Hawaii the central zone for his development into who he will become. And that is a statue that doesn't make sense anywhere but Hawaii. Because he left Sui Hung when he was very young. And he didn't like Sui Hung. When he went back, he essentially did violence to the town itself. He destroyed their idol. And so any attempt to remember Sun Yat-sen in Sui Hung is sort of hollow because it's where he was born, but he didn't like it. Unless you're trying to emphasize the poverty or the humble circumstances of his origins, which is what some sources do. So it's a very distinctive statue that sits in Gateway Park, or the new, I guess it's not new anymore, Sun Yat-sen Park in Chinatown in Honolulu. But just a bit about the father of modern China. So Mayor Hahnemann refers to the father of modern China, Sun Yat-sen. That is a very Deng Xiaoping era and beyond interpretation of Sun Yat-sen. Back in the Mao years, especially in the Soviet era, the 50s, he was remembered more as the forebear of the Democratic Revolution, because they were very much trying to honor the Soviets. They were trying to keep in line with the official Soviet understanding of Marxism, of Marxist-Leninism, and of how history worked. So Sun Yat-sen was not the democratic revolutionary, because Mao was the democratic revolutionary. So Sun Yat-sen was his forebear. He was the one who started it. He didn't finish it. And that was how he was remembered, at least in 1956, at his birthday celebration, because he was born in 1866. So this was his 90th birthday anniversary. And the fact that they did this ceremony tells you something quite significant. They're trying to link Sun Yat-sen and his revolutionary heritage, and all that he represents, to the new People's Republic. They need some legitimacy. They need to reach back into the past. And they find that they can take hold of Sun Yat-sen in some way. But in 1966, it's the period of the Cultural Revolution. This is actually the last time anyone ever sees Liu Shaoqi in public. After this, he's imprisoned and he dies in prison. And so this was it was a venue for humiliation of Liu Shaoqi. But for the people who were commemorating Sun, including Song Qingling, they're also offering defenses of Sun Yat-sen. They're offering apologies in the Socratic sense. And so He Xiangning compares Sun Yat-sen to the Mao of his time, which is a very different relationship than the revolutionary forebear. Now Sun Yat-sen is equal to Mao instead of being sort of an inferior predecessor,
Mm-hmm.
And so she says, I was proud to follow Sun then, and I'm proud to follow Mao now. And Song Qingling emphasizes Sun Yat-sen. He was a patriot. He was a poor boy. He had to learn everything on his own. He had nothing given to him. And even so, he was so generous. He was so selfless. And he was concerned with nothing but the welfare of the people of China. And so she's covering for herself, because she's the widow of Sun Yat-sen. So if he goes down in the Cultural Revolution, that's a real problem for her.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, she's also offering this new version of Sun Yat-sen that can survive this difficult time. It's not just about self-preservation, it's about historical conservation. And it's about really describing what she thinks is attractive about the PRC. What she thinks of as a China concerned with the welfare of the common person. She's sort of silently criticizing the cultural revolutionaries for losing sight of what made the PRC worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of these different speeches, but I think Song Qingling and He Xiangning have two of the more interesting ones. Zhou Enlai, for his part, just repeats what Mao said 10 years before. Because Mao doesn't speak at this time. Mao spoke at the 1956 commemoration. He does not speak in 66. By 1976, Mao is dead. Zhou Enlai is dead. Song Qingling was very old. Or was she dead? Oh, she was just very old. He Xiangning is dead. And people are concerned with the trial of the Gang of Four. People don't care that much about Sun Yat-sen's birthday. There's a small series of small commemorations. It's a real B-list of the Communist Party, who's who. No one really significant, no one that really would capture the eye that much. It was very much not. It was not a significant event in 1976, but in 1986 it's significant again. And in 1996 it's significant. 2006 it's significant. 2016 it's significant. And that's because Sun
Presumably
Yat-sen found a new place.
2026 it'll be significant.
We don't know that for sure, but based on past trends, we'd be willing to guess. But the post-Dung is, the Dung Reforms, for those listening, those were a series of economic reforms after Deng Xiaoping takes power in 1978. And this is where you see the marketization of China. This is where you see the reform and opening up, as it's called. And so it's not so much about ideology anymore. You don't have to fit Sun Yat-sen into this category of the democratic predecessor. You don't have to save his skin from the cultural revolutionaries, and in fact, save your own skin as well if you're associated with him. Now you have a different use for Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is a nationalist figure of modernization, of modern Chinese capitalism, of a strong country and a modern country, participating in the world on equal terms. It's a very different image of Sun Yat-sen that's more in line with what he actually wrote. But it's also used for its own purposes. I would argue that since 1986, the nationalist part of it has been further emphasized, especially in the 2016 speech, which Xi Jinping uses as a chance to remind overseas Chinese of their links to the Chinese mainland, the Chinese nation, and the Chinese communal destiny. And so we see Sun Yat-sen invoked as a way to not just commemorate the PRC, to commemorate what came before the PRC, and to provide a foil, because that is one thing. Sun Yat-sen was so poor, but he'd be so proud of what we've done since then. It's also a way to remind overseas Chinese, this is one of yours. He spent so little time in China, but he always remembered who he was. He always remembered where his interests lay and where his destiny lied. And so there's a very strong international component to this. And this is also related to how Taiwan changes in these commemorative speeches. But I guess I'm getting a bit far afield from the statues now.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're just about out of time here, but I mean, he's such an interesting figure. And I think based on everything you've said, it might even arguably be the case that he was more important after his death than during his life. I mean, that might be something controversial to say, but I think it's something that can be argued just based off of everything that you're saying here. For those who are interested in reading more about him, this will just be the last question, just a rapid fire question. Can you name just like one or two books, and then if they're a student, they can go on a ProQuest and they can read your thesis. So just give me like one or two books you recommend, and then what is the name of your thesis if people want to go and read it on ProQuest?
So first, the most recent definitive biography of Sun Yat-sen is by Marie-Claire Berger. It's just called Sun Yat-sen.
Mm-hmm.
That's the name of the book. It's a very good biography. It's the most modern. Henry Schifflin also has one. It's a little bit older, but it's also a good biography. And Origins of a Heroic Image by J.Y. Wong. It's a very interesting look into the London kidnapping and its ramifications. As for my thesis, it's called Sun Yat-sen's Contested Political Image, or what? Yeah, Contested Political Images of a Political Icon, or something like that.
Yeah, I'll attach the link below if people are a student. I don't think non-students can access it, but if anyone listening is a student, they can click on the link below and access it through their university. But yeah, great talk. Thank you, Tom, for coming on the show.
Certainly. Hopefully I didn't rant too much.
No, not at all. And for those who are interested in more podcasts like this, you can click on the suggested videos below, and we will see you next time.